Welcome to Vesper Shroud, where Alaska's darkest secrets rise from the ice. Tonight's 9 forbidden phenomena will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe now to unlock more true horror each week. Early story drops, hidden episodes only for followers, and deeper investigations into encounters others fear to touch. Your support keeps these stories alive and brings new ones to light. Stay with us, step inside, and let the unknown find you first, waiting in the dark for you now. Story 1. Signal from Gakona. I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. There are places in Alaska where the sky itself can break, where darkness doesn't just fall. It opens up and swallows everything whole. I know this because I saw it happen. I heard what came through. My name is Marcus Webb, and until 3 months ago, I was a communications technician stationed at a radio telescope facility near Tok, Alaska. We monitored atmospheric phenomena, tracked solar flares, recorded data that most people would find mind-numbingly boring. I thought the most dangerous thing about my job was the isolation and the brutal winter cold that could kill you in minutes if your truck broke down on the wrong stretch of highway. I was wrong about everything. It started on February 9th, during one of those endless Alaskan nights where the darkness feels thick enough to touch. I was alone in the monitoring station, watching my screens through tired eyes, when every instrument in the building went haywire simultaneously. Static exploded across all frequencies. The needle on our electromagnetic field detector slammed so far right it cracked the glass. And then, cutting through the chaos, came a sound I will never forget. A pure tone, clean and terrible, like someone had taken loneliness itself and given it a voice. The signal lasted exactly 47 seconds. When it stopped, the silence that followed felt somehow worse than the noise. My hands were shaking as I pulled up the directional data, trying to pinpoint the source. The coordinates made my blood run cold. The signal had originated from Gakona, about 200 miles southwest, home to the HAARP research facility, a place that had spawned 1,000 conspiracy theories and twice as many nightmares. I heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Alaska had. Rumors about experiments that could control the weather, manipulate minds, punch holes in the atmosphere itself. Most people dismissed it as paranoid nonsense. But sitting there in that dark room, staring at data that shouldn't exist, I felt the first cold finger of real fear trace down my spine. The next morning, I called my supervisor. He listened to my recording of the signal, and I could hear the tension in his voice when he told me to delete everything and forget about it. When I pressed him, asked him what was really going on, he hung up on me. An hour later, I received an email informing me I was being transferred to a facility in Fairbanks, effective immediately. That's when I knew I had stumbled onto something horrifying. I should have taken the transfer. I should have packed my bags, driven north, and never looked back. Instead, I did what any fool with more curiosity than sense would do. I started digging. I reached out to other operators, people I met at conferences, technicians at facilities scattered across Alaska. Most of them refused to talk. But one woman, a radio astronomer named Dr. Sarah Chen, agreed to meet me at a truck stop outside Palmer. She looked exhausted when she slid into the booth across from me, her eyes ringed with dark circles that spoke of too many sleepless nights. She ordered coffee she didn't drink and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, constantly glancing toward the door like she expected something to follow her inside. "You picked up the Gakona signal?" she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, and she closed her eyes like it just confirmed her worst fear. "Then you need to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Back in 2003, HAARP ran an experiment. They called it Project Aurora Watch, and officially, it was supposed to study how high-frequency radio waves interacted with the ionosphere. But that's not what they were really doing." She pulled out a weathered folder, sliding it across the scarred Formica table. Inside were documents, some official-looking with government seals, others that appeared to be personal notes written in shaking handwriting. For 47 seconds, they aimed their entire array at a specific point above the Wrangell Mountains and fired it at full power. Witnesses reported that the aurora, the northern lights that had been dancing across the sky, just vanished. Not faded, vanished. And in its place, there was this void, this absolute blackness that didn't reflect any light at all. My mouth had gone dry. What was it? We done. Do you know? But every radio telescope in Alaska picked up something coming from it. A signal, the same one you heard last week. She leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. Here is the truly terrifying part. The signal wasn't random noise. It was structured, organized. And when they ran it through analysis software, looking for patterns, they found something that made them shut down the entire experiment and classify everything above top secret. What did they find? Intent. The signal showed intent. Something was responding to what they'd done. Something was aware, and it was hungry. The fear in her eyes was genuine and deep. This wasn't some conspiracy theorist spinning tales in a dark corner of the internet. This was a respected scientist, her voice shaking with barely controlled terror, telling me that we had opened a door to something that should have stayed closed forever. She explained that after the experiment, strange things began happening in the area around Gakona. Pilots flying over the Wrangell Mountains reported seeing darkness where there shouldn't be any, patches of night sky that seemed somehow darker than the surrounding blackness, areas where their instruments would fail and their radios would fill with that same haunting tone. Some of them saw shapes moving in that void, silhouettes that didn't match anything they recognized. 3 pilots disappeared entirely. Their planes were never found. The government quietly banned any further experiments of that type. HAARP, its research shifted to safer, more conventional studies. But the damage was done. The sky over Gakona had been torn open, and apparently it hadn't fully healed. It comes back, Dr. Chen said, her hands wrapped tight around her untouched coffee cup. On certain nights, when the conditions are right, the tear reopens. And every time it does, that signal comes through, stronger each time, like whatever is on the other side is learning, getting better at reaching through. I felt sick. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to stay away from Gakona. Whatever you do, Dawn, to go there. Dawn, to investigate further. People who dig too deep into this have a habit of vanishing. Or worse. What? It's worse than vanishing. She looked at me with eyes that had seen something no one should ever witness. Coming back changed. Coming back wrong. We parted ways after that. And I spent the next week trying to convince myself to let it go. I had the information I needed. I knew the signal was real, knew it was dangerous, knew I should walk away and never think about it again. The smart move was obvious. But fear has a strange way of mixing with curiosity, creating a toxic cocktail that drives people to do foolish things. And I couldn't stop thinking about those missing pilots, about the idea that somewhere above the frozen wilderness of Alaska, there was a hole in reality itself, and something on the other side was waiting. I started monitoring the frequencies again, watching for any sign of the signal, its return. My supervisor called twice more, his threats becoming less veiled each time. I ignored him. I was past the point of caring about my job, my career, anything except understanding what I had heard in that 47-second burst of impossible sound. On March 2nd, during another long polar night, it happened again. The signal came through at 2:17 in the morning, and this time I was ready. I recorded everything: audio, spectral analysis, electromagnetic readings, and I tracked the source with precision. The coordinates were exact. The tear had reopened in the same location, directly above a remote stretch of wilderness near the old HAARP facility. I made a decision that would haunt me forever. I was going to Gakona. The drive took 2 days through some of the most desolate country in Alaska. Mile after mile of snow-covered forest, mountains that looked like the broken teeth of ancient giants, and a highway so empty I went hours without seeing another vehicle. The isolation was absolute, the kind of loneliness that makes you understand why people go mad in places like this. I reached the area around midnight on March 4th. The HAARP facility itself was fenced off and dark, but I wasn't interested in the buildings. I wanted to see the sky above them, to find out if the stories were true. I parked my truck on a fire road that wound up into the hills overlooking the valley. The temperature had dropped to -30, cold enough that my breath froze in crystalline clouds and the snow crunched like broken glass under my boots. I set up my portable equipment, aimed my directional antenna at the coordinates Dr. Chen had given me, and waited. The aurora was dancing that night, green and purple curtains of light rippling across the darkness in hypnotic waves. Beautiful, peaceful, normal. And then, at exactly 2:17, the same time the signal had appeared the previous night, everything changed. The aurora didn't fade. It tore. One moment it was there, shimmering and alive. The next, it was gone, ripped away like someone had grabbed the fabric of the sky and yanked it aside. And beneath it was nothing. Pure, absolute blackness. A void so complete that it seemed to pull at my eyes. drawing my gaze into its depths. The signal came through my equipment immediately, that same terrible tone, but hearing it here, standing beneath the tear itself, was different. It wasn't just sound, it was presence. It felt like something vast and ancient had turned its attention toward me. And I was suddenly aware of how small I was, how fragile, how utterly insignificant. And then I saw them. Shapes, moving in the blackness. They didn't have forms, exactly. They were more like absences of light, dark against darkness, but somehow visible in the way that a hole in your vision is visible. They moved with purpose, circling, descending, and as I watched in frozen horror, one of them began to emerge from the tear. It pushed through slowly, like something forcing its way through a membrane. I couldn't process what I was seeing. My mind refused to make sense of the geometry, the way it seemed to exist in more dimensions than should be possible. But I could feel its hunger, that psychic pulse Dr. Chen had mentioned. It wasn't metaphorical. It was real and overwhelming and directed straight at me. I ran. I don't remember getting back to my truck. I don't remember starting the engine or pulling onto the highway. The next thing I knew, I was 50 miles away, doing 90 on an icy road, my hands locked on the steering wheel and my heart trying to hammer its way out of my chest. But I hadn't escaped. Not really, because when I looked in my rearview mirror, the darkness was following me. It shouldn't have been possible. I was moving at highway speed, putting mile after mile between myself and Gakona, but the void was there in my mirror, a patch of absolute blackness that seemed to hover just above the road behind me. And in that darkness, I could see the shapes again, keeping pace, never falling behind. I drove for 3 hours straight, not stopping, barely breathing, watching that impossible darkness trail me like a predator that knew I couldn't run forever. It only vanished when the first light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, dissolving like smoke in sunlight. I made it back to my facility. I went through the motions of packing my things, accepting my transfer, moving to Fairbanks like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. I had seen what was waiting in that tear above Gakona. I had felt its attention fixed on me. And now, 3 months later, I know it's not finished with me. The signal comes every night now. Not through my equipment. I destroyed all of that, smashed it to pieces and scattered the components across 3 different landfills. No, the signal comes through my own head. I hear it in the quiet moments, that pure tone cutting through my thoughts like a blade. I see the shapes in shadows and dark corners, always at the edge of my vision, always watching. Last week, I looked up at the night sky and saw the stars had gone wrong. The constellations were shifted, rearranged into patterns that hurt to look at. And there, directly overhead, was a patch of darkness that was somehow darker than the space around it. The tear had followed me, or maybe I had brought it with me. Maybe when you stare into that kind of void, when you let it see you truly see you, it marks you somehow. Marks you as something that belongs on the other side. I don't sleep anymore. When I close my eyes, I'm back on that fire road, watching something impossible push its way through reality itself. And I know with absolute certainty that one of these nights, it is going to finish what it started. It is going to reach through completely, and I am going to discover what happens to the people who dig too deep into Gakona as secrets. What happens to the ones who come back changed, come back wrong? So if you ever find yourself driving through Alaska on one of those endless polar nights, and you see darkness that seems too dark, that pulls at your eyes and whispers to your mind, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look too long, because some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. And something is always waiting on the other side, patient and hungry, for the next fool who dares to look up at the stars and wonder what looks back. Story 2. Thaw. Have you ever wondered what nightmares are buried in the frozen ground beneath your feet? In Alaska, something ancient woke up last spring, and the people who breathed its air never came back the same. Some of them never came back at all. I moved to Fairbanks 3 years ago for work. Nothing glamorous, just maintenance at the university research station, keeping generators running and pipes from freezing during the brutal winters. The job paid well and I needed the distance from my old life in Phoenix. Divorce does that to a man. Makes him want to disappear into a place so remote that even his own thoughts can find him. Alaska seemed perfect for that. Cold, empty, honest in its hostility. Last March changed everything. The winter had been unusually mild, and by the time spring arrived, temperatures were climbing faster than anyone had seen in decades. The permafrost started thawing in patches across the tundra, revealing ground that hadn't seen sunlight in thousands of years. The scientists at the station were excited. They talked about methane readings and ancient organic matter like kids on Christmas morning. But there was something else in that thawing earth, something that had been waiting a very long time to bloom again. I first saw the flowers on a routine supply run to one of the remote monitoring stations. They appeared overnight, covering a hillside in a carpet of deep crimson that looked wrong against the pale Arctic landscape. Not the healthy red of roses or poppies. This was darker, the color of old blood or rusted metal, the color of something that should have stayed buried. Each flower stood about 8 inches tall with petals that seemed to pulse slightly in the breeze, and at their center sat thick stamens covered in pollen so bright it almost glowed. The smell hit me when I stepped out of the truck, sweet and heavy, like overripe fruit mixed with something chemical I couldn't identify. It made my head swim immediately, but I figured it was just the shock of spring after months of frozen emptiness. I took photos for the research team and headed back to the station. That was my first mistake. Getting close enough to breathe it in, letting that pollen into my lungs where it could take root in something deeper than flesh. The dream started that night. I stood in a jungle so thick and green it hurt my eyes. Massive ferns towered overhead, their fronds the size of truck beds. The air was hot and wet, pressing against my skin like a living thing. Strange calls echoed through the vegetation. Not bird calls, not anything I recognized. Something older, something that existed before birds learned to sing. The sound made my spine feel like ice despite the suffocating heat. But the terrifying part wasn't the jungle itself. It was the feeling of rightness, of being home. Like this place was where I truly belonged, where I had always belonged, and everything else had been the nightmare. The cold Alaskan tundra, the research station, my entire life, all of it felt like a bad dream I was finally waking up from. When I actually woke up, sweating and disoriented in my small room at the station, the rawness crashed over me like a wave. The gray walls, the industrial heating system rattling in the corner, the window showing nothing but white snow and pale sky. It all felt false, temporary, like a stage set that would be struck down any moment to reveal the real world beneath. The green world, the warm world, the world I suddenly knew in my bones was the truth. I wasn't the only one dreaming. By the second day, half the station staff reported similar nightmares. Tropical landscapes, prehistoric forests, the overwhelming sensation that modern Alaska was somehow wrong, that the ice and snow were an aberration covering up what the land truly was underneath. The head researcher, a woman named Dr. Chen who had spent 15 years studying Arctic ecology, broke down crying during the morning meeting. She kept saying she wanted to go home, but when someone asked where home was, she couldn't answer. She just pointed south and wept. The flowers were spreading. Satellite imagery showed new crimson patches appearing across hundreds of square miles of tundra. Wherever the permafrost thawed, they bloomed. And wherever they bloomed, people started changing, started seeing things that couldn't be real but felt more true than anything they had ever known. On the third day, Dr. Chen walked out into the tundra and never came back. She left before dawn without telling anyone, wearing nothing but pajamas and slippers. The security footage showed her face as she passed the camera. She was smiling, not the desperate smile of someone losing their mind, but the peaceful smile of someone finally finding their way home after being lost for a very long time. Search teams found her tracks heading south toward the flower fields, but the trail went cold after 2 miles. Like she had simply vanished into the landscape. She wasn't the first. Reports were coming in from across Alaska, people walking into the wilderness with that same peaceful expression. Hunters, teachers, oil workers, fishermen, all of them heading toward the crimson flowers like pilgrims drawn to a shrine. Some were found days later, frozen but still wearing that terrible smile. Others disappeared completely, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the Alaskan interior. I should have left, should have packed my truck and driven south until I hit the Canadian border and kept going. But the dreams were getting stronger, more vivid, more real, and the waking world was getting harder to bear. The research station felt like a prison. Every gray wall and metal surface seemed to mock me with its artificiality. The heating system, its rattle sounded like grinding teeth. The fluorescent lights hurt my eyes with their fake brightness. I found myself standing at windows for hours, staring out at the tundra, searching for flashes of crimson against the white. And when I saw them, My chest would tighten with something that felt like grief and longing mixed together into an emotion I had no name for. The hallucination started on day 5. I was outside checking a generator when the air shimmered and the world changed. For just a moment, the snow vanished. The research station disappeared. I stood in that impossible jungle again, but this time I was awake. Huge dragonflies the size of hawks zipped through the humid air. Something massive moved through the ferns to my left, shaking the ground with footsteps that belonged to no modern animal. The calls I had heard in my dreams surrounded me now, coming from every direction at once. Then I blinked and it was gone. Snow and cold and the grinding generator. But the other place felt more real than where I stood. The jungle felt solid while reality felt thin, like tissue paper I could push through if I just tried hard enough. I wasn't alone in seeing it. The remaining station staff reported similar experiences. Brief glimpses of another world bleeding through our own. A prehistoric Alaska that existed millions of years ago. Before the ice came. Before the cold. When the entire region sat near the equator and teemed with life we couldn't imagine. The pollen was showing us that lost world, making us remember something that happened long before humans existed to remember anything. But it wasn't just showing us, it was calling us. The despair hit on day 6 like a physical weight. Waking up to the cold, frozen world felt like dying. Every breath of Arctic air burned my lungs with its wrongness. The landscape looked like a corpse, dead and empty and frozen in an eternal winter that should never have come. How could we live like this? How had we ever lived like this? In this cold tomb pretending to be a place where life belonged? I understood why people walked into the wilderness. They weren't running from something. They were running toward it, toward the truth that the pollen revealed, toward the warm, green world that Alaska had been and should have been and, in some impossible way, still was if you just knew how to see it. The expedition team sent to study the flowers never came back. 12 scientists in hazmat suits ventured into the largest field of crimson blooms. Their radio transmissions started normal. Pollen counts, temperature readings, soil samples. Then the voices changed, got quieter, more distant. They started describing things that couldn't be there. Trees that don't exist. Animals that went extinct millions of years ago. The last transmission was just breathing and soft laughter, like children discovering something wonderful. Then silence. The satellite tracking showed their position stationary in the flower field for 3 days. Then the signals went dead. When recovery teams finally reached the site a week later, they found the hazmat suits empty and neatly folded. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just empty suits arranged in a circle around a patch of ground where the flowers grew thicker than anywhere else, their crimson petals opening wide like mouths waiting to be fed. I knew I was next. The pull was getting stronger. Every night the dreams lasted longer. Every day the hallucinations became more frequent and more detailed. I could feel myself slipping away from this cold reality into that warm, impossible past. Part of me wanted to fight it. The rational part that knew the flowers were some kind of ancient spore or chemical compound playing havoc with my brain chemistry. But a larger part didn't care about explanations. That part just wanted to go home. On day 8, I found myself walking. I don't remember leaving the station. Don't remember putting on my coat or boots. I just suddenly became aware that I was 3 miles out on the tundra, heading toward a distant hillside covered in crimson flowers. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to ripple and breathe. And I felt happy, truly, deeply happy for the first time in years. The cold didn't touch me. The wind passed through me like I wasn't really there anymore. Maybe I wasn't. Maybe I had already crossed over into that other place and this was just my body going through the motions of a journey my mind had already completed. The flowers grew closer with each step, and I could smell them now. That sweet, chemical scent that made my head swim and my heart race. Then I saw her, Dr. Chen. She stood among the flowers, and she looked different. Younger somehow. Healthier. Her skin had a green tint to it, like chlorophyll was replacing the blood in her veins. She was smiling that same peaceful smile from the security footage, and when she saw me, she reached out her hand. I almost took it, almost let her pull me into that field of crimson blooms and whatever waited beyond them. But something stopped me. A memory. My daughter? His face. Not from my real daughter who I barely saw anymore, but from a photo I kept in my wallet. A picture of her at age 6, laughing at Disneyland, before the divorce, before I ran away to Alaska to hide from my failures. The memory felt like ice water. Shocking and painful and real in a way the warm jungle couldn't match. My daughter existed in this cold, frozen world, not in the impossible past the flowers promised. And if I walked into those blooms, I would leave her behind forever, just another missing person who chased a beautiful hallucination into oblivion. I turned and ran back toward the station with Dr. Chen, his laughter following me, light and musical and utterly devoid of humanity. The hallucinations chased me. Ferns sprouted from the snow. Massive insects buzzed past my head. The calls of extinct animals echoed across the tundra. But I kept running, kept my eyes on the distant lights of the research station, kept thinking about my daughter and the real world no matter how gray and cold and wrong it felt. I made it back, barely. The staff sedated me and kept me under medical observation for 3 days. By the time I woke up, the flowers were dying. The warm spell had broken. A late-season cold snap swept across Alaska, and the crimson blooms withered and turned black, collapsing back into the refreezing permafrost. The hallucination stopped. The dreams faded. Reality solidified again into its familiar cold, harsh truth. But the seeds remained. The botanists who studied the dead flowers found them. Millions of microscopic seeds, each one protected by a shell that could survive thousands of years of freezing. They were in the permafrost now, waiting for the next thaw, the next warm spell, the next chance to bloom and show people what Alaska used to be. I left Alaska 3 months ago, got a job in Houston where it's hot and sticky and nothing like that impossible jungle, but close enough to make me nervous sometimes. I don't sleep well. Every warm night makes me anxious. Every flower I see makes my heart race. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I am back in that prehistoric forest, hearing those ancient calls, feeling that terrible sense of belonging. 47 people disappeared during those 8 days. 47 people walked into the wilderness chasing a hallucination of paradise and never came back. The official explanation was mass hysteria triggered by unknown chemical compounds in the pollen. The families got closure. The scientists got data. Everyone moved on. But I know the truth. Those people aren't dead. They were not gone. They were somewhere else. Somewhere that exists in the memory of the land itself, in the deep history written into every molecule of ancient pollen. They found their way home to a world that shouldn't to exist but does, hidden in the spaces between what was and what is. And sometimes, late at night when the air conditioning breaks and the Houston heat presses in like a living thing, I wonder if they made the right choice. If trading this harsh, modern world for that impossible paradise was wisdom rather than madness. The doubt terrifies me more than anything else, because doubt means part of me is still listening, still waiting, still hoping for another spring thaw in Alaska that will let those crimson flowers bloom again. The climate scientists say it's just a matter of time. The permafrost is melting faster every year. The seeds are waiting. And next time the flowers bloom, I dawn to know if I'll be strong enough to run away. Next time, I might finally go home to a place I've never been, to a time before time, to a green and terrible paradise buried under all that ice and snow and frozen earth. The real horror ISN that the flowers will return. It's that part of me wants them to. Part of me is still standing in that field at sunset, reaching for Dr. Chen, his hand, ready to step across into whatever beautiful nightmare waits among those crimson petals. Some seeds should stay buried. Some memories should remain frozen, and some paradises are better left as dreams rather than destinations. But the earth remembers everything, and when it thaws, those memories bloom again in colors we were never meant to see. I just hope I'm far enough south when it happens. Hope the flowers can reach me here. Hope that part of me that still dreams of ferns and heat in ancient calls can stay quiet and forgotten. But hope is just another kind of waiting, and the seeds in the permafrost are very, very patient. Story 3. Echo Box. The reflection was wrong. I noticed it immediately when I pulled up to the Buckner building in Whittier, Alaska. The structure towered above me, 14 stories of crumbling concrete and shattered windows, a Cold War relic slowly rotting at the edge of Prince William Sound. But when I glanced at the water, at the building, its reflection rippling on the surface, something felt off. The reflection looked newer, cleaner. The windows were intact. Lights glowed in rooms that I knew were dark and abandoned. I told myself it was just the weird Alaska light playing tricks. Late September, and the days were already getting short this far north. Shadows did strange things up here. But that uneasy feeling stayed with me as I grabbed my camera and exploration gear from my truck. I was a YouTuber. Nothing fancy, Just a guy in his 40s who documented abandoned places across America. My channel had maybe 30,000 subscribers, people who liked watching me poke around old hospitals and forgotten factories. The Buckner building was supposed to be my biggest video yet. The largest abandoned building in Alaska. A massive military complex built during World War II, designed to house thousands of soldiers in one self-contained structure. Now it stood empty, slowly collapsing, a monument to Cold War paranoia and Alaska's brutal isolation. The first floor was what I expected. Graffiti on the walls, broken glass everywhere. The smell of mold and decay so thick I could taste it. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a steady rhythm that echoed through empty corridors. I filmed everything, narrating for my audience about the building, its history, keeping my voice steady even though something about the place made my skin crawl. The creepy part was the silence between the drips. Total silence. No wind, no birds, no distant traffic sounds from the small town of Whittier just a quarter-mile away. Just that dripping and my own breathing, loud in my ears. I found the basement stairs around 3 in the afternoon. The metal door hung open, rusted hinges groaning as I pushed through. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness below, revealing concrete steps descending into shadows that seemed too thick, too solid. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to leave, but I'd driven 8 hours to get here. My subscribers were expecting content, and more than that, I was curious. That dangerous kind of curiosity that makes people do stupid things. The basement was a maze. Corridors branched off in every direction, doors hanging open to reveal rooms filled with debris and rusted equipment. Old boilers, electrical panels, storage spaces packed with the forgotten garbage of military life decades past. The ceiling was low, pressing down, and the darkness seemed to resist my flashlight, swallowing the beam after just a few feet. That's when I heard it, a sound like humming, mechanical and constant, coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. I followed it, my camera recording everything, my heart beating faster with each step. The room was at the end of a long corridor. The door was different from the others. Heavy steel, marked with faded warnings in Russian and English. Radiation symbols, biohazard markers, the kind of official danger signs that make you realize the Cold War was built on terror and secrets. The door stood open. Someone had been here before me, cutting through the locks with tools that left bright metal scars on the old steel. Inside, the room was small, maybe 10 feet square. Empty except for a metal table in the center. And on that table, humming with a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones, was a box. It was lead-lined. I could tell by the weight when I got closer. The lid was open, revealing a device inside that looked like nothing I'd ever seen. Brass horns arranged in a circle, pointing inward toward a central chamber. Tubes and wires connecting everything in patterns that seemed random but somehow purposeful. The whole thing was maybe 2 feet across, intricate and beautiful and deeply unsettling. The humming came from the device itself, a low vibration that I could feel in my teeth. And as I stood there, filming, recording this horrifying and eerie discovery, the humming changed. It grew louder, more complex, and then it started playing sounds. Not playing, that's not the right word. Recreating. The device was recreating sounds, pulling them from somewhere and pushing them into the air around me. First came the sound of construction, hammers and saws, men shouting to each other in English, their voices young and full of purpose. I heard trucks rumbling, equipment clanging, the organized chaos of a massive building project. The sounds were crystal clear, like I was standing in the middle of a construction site in 1943, watching the Buckner building rise from the Alaska tundra. Then the sounds changed. Conversations now. Soldiers talking about the war, about home, about the endless Alaska darkness and the fear of Japanese invasion. I heard laughter, arguments, someone singing a song I didn't recognize, his voice echoing down corridors that wouldn't exist for another year in the timeline the device was playing. I should have run, should have grabbed my camera and gotten out of that basement, out of that building, and driven straight back to Anchorage without looking back. But I couldn't. To move. I stood frozen, watching the device, listening to decades of sound pouring out of those brass horns. The sounds kept progressing forward in time. I heard the building, its prime years, thousands of soldiers living in these walls, their footsteps and voices and daily lives compressed into minutes of audio that shouldn't exist. Then came the decline. Fewer voices, doors slamming shut for the last time, the building emptying out as the military moved on, leaving this massive structure to rot in the Alaska rain. And then came the screaming. It started as one voice, a man yelling in terror about something I couldn't hear. Then another voice joined, then 10, then 100, 1,000, more. The screams built on top of each other, layering into a wall of sound so horrifying and disturbing that I dropped my camera and clapped my hands over my ears. But it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside my head, bypassing my ears entirely. The device somehow broadcasting directly into my brain. The screams were unified, everyone screaming the same thing at the same moment. A catastrophe that had happened here, in this building or near it. Something so terrible that it had left an echo in the air itself. And this device, this nightmare machine of brass and lead, was catching those echoes and playing them back. Do you know how long I stood there, my hands pressed to my ears, the screaming filling my skull? It felt like hours. When it finally stopped, when the device returned to that low mechanical hum, I realized I was on my knees. My throat was raw. I'd been screaming too, adding my voice to the chorus without realizing it. I grabbed my camera with shaking hands. The battery was almost dead, but it had kept recording. I had proof, evidence of something impossible and terrifying. I backed out of the room, keeping my flashlight beam on the device, half expecting it to chase me. But it just sat there on its table, humming its constant note, waiting for someone else to find it. Getting out of the basement should have been simple. I marked my path, left breadcrumbs of mental landmarks to follow back. But the corridors had changed. Doors that I passed were now closed. Hallways led in directions I didn't remember. And everywhere, echoing through the darkness, I could hear sounds that the device had played. Footsteps from 1945. Voices from 1952. All of it leaking through the building like the walls themselves had become speakers. I found a different stairway, stumbled up into the daylight. The sun was setting, painting Prince William Sound in shades of orange and red. I ran to my truck, threw my gear in the back, and sat behind the wheel trying to catch my breath. That is when I looked at the water again, at the building, its reflection. It was perfect, pristine. The Buckner building as it must have looked in its prime, all 14 stories intact and gleaming. Lights blazed in every window, and in those windows, I could see shapes moving. People, hundreds of them, thousands, living their lives in a building that no longer existed, caught in a reflection that refused to show the truth. I drove away fast, didn't stop until I reached Anchorage 3 hours later. I checked into a motel and tried to review my footage. The camera had recorded everything. The descent into the basement, the room, the device, but the audio was wrong. Instead of the sounds I heard, the camera had captured only silence and my own voice narrating. And underneath it all, barely audible, that same mechanical hum. I posted the video anyway. Called it The Echo Box. Alaska's most haunted discovery. My subscribers ate it up. The view count climbed into the hundreds of thousands. People commented about the creepy atmosphere, the unsettling device, the way I described the sounds even though they couldn't hear them on the recording. Then the messages started coming. Private messages from other explorers, people who'd been to Whittier. They all seen the same thing. The reflection in the water not matching the building. Some had heard sounds too. Construction noises in the dead of night. Screaming from empty rooms. One guy claimed he found the device 3 years earlier, had touched it, and now couldn't stop hearing those unified screams. They came to him in dreams, in quiet moments, a constant reminder of something terrible that had happened and been forgotten. I tried to research it, spent weeks digging through military records and local history. There were gaps, periods in the Buckner building, this timeline where documentation simply didn't exist. Classified projects, experiments that the Cold War had buried under layers of secrecy and official denial. Whatever had happened, whatever catastrophe had left those screams echoing in the air, someone had gone to great lengths to erase it from history. But you can erase sound. Not completely. It lingers, bounces around, waits in the darkness for something to catch it and play it back. 3 months after my exploration, I started hearing it in my own apartment. That mechanical hum, faint at first, easy to dismiss as the refrigerator or the building's heating system. But it grew louder, more insistent, and then, late at night when Anchorage was quiet and dark, I could hear other sounds. Footsteps in empty hallways, voices speaking in languages I didn't understand. And underneath it all, building slowly like a storm approaching, the sound of people preparing to scream. I went back to Whittier last week. Couldn't to help myself. I needed to understand, needed to know what that device was and why it had chosen me to hear its nightmare sounds. The Buckner building still stood, still rotting, still casting its impossible reflection on Prince William Sound. But something had changed. The device was gone from the basement room. Someone had taken it, or maybe it had moved itself. And all through the building, humming from every wall and floor, I could hear that same mechanical vibration. The entire structure had become an echo chamber, catching and holding every sound that had ever occurred within its walls. I found new graffiti in the basement, fresh paint on concrete that hadn't seen visitors in months. It was a warning, written in shaky letters by someone who understood what was happening here. It said, "The echo never ends. The screams are still coming. Alaska remembers everything." I'm writing this from my truck, parked outside the building as night falls. I can see my reflection in the side mirror, and behind me, in the glass, I can see the Buckner building as it exists in the reflection. Perfect, whole, alive with light and movement. The version of itself that the echo box has decided is real. My reflection is changing too, getting younger. My clothes shifting into military uniform. I am becoming part of the echo, part of the sound that never stops playing. And I can hear it now, constant in my ears. That mechanical hum building toward something terrible. The catastrophe hasn't happened yet. It's still coming, still building. The echo box doesn't just play the past. It records the future too. And in that future, in the moment that is approaching faster than I can escape, I'm going to add my voice to the unified screaming. Prince William Sound is perfectly still tonight. The reflection shows me the truth. The building I sent abandoned. It's full, packed with every person who ever entered and heard the device as song. All of us trapped in the echo, playing back forever, our screams mixing with the construction sounds and the soldier, its voices and the catastrophe that refuses to be forgotten. The hum is getting louder now. My ears are bleeding. The device found me, or I found it, in the darkness of the Cold War, its most haunted building, in Alaska, its most isolated corner. The echo box is doing what it was designed to do. Recording everything, playing it back, making sure that some sounds, some terrors, never truly end. And as I sit here, feeling the scream building in my throat, I can see others approaching in my mirror. Other explorers, other curious souls drawn to Whittier and the Buckner building. They walking toward the entrance. They going to find the device, wherever it has hidden itself. They going to hear what I heard. And their screams will join ours, adding to the echo, making it stronger, until everyone who ever comes to this place becomes part of Alaska, its most haunted chorus, singing forever in the reflection that refuses to show the truth. The hum is everything now. The scream is starting, and the echo box records it all. Story 4. Voice in the ice. What would you do if you heard a human voice screaming from inside a glacier? A voice that has been trapped in the ice for over a century, begging to be freed. I am a glaciologist, and what I discovered inside Mendenhall Glacier near Juneau will make you question everything you think you know about what lies frozen beneath Alaska, this ancient ice. My name is Dr. Rebecca Torres, and I spent 15 years studying glaciers. I thought I'd seen everything the ice could reveal. Prehistoric animals, ancient artifacts, even the occasional human remains from mountaineering accidents. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what we found in the deep caves of Mendenhall Glacier last March. The recordings we made that day have been classified, buried under layers of government secrecy. But I need someone to know the truth before it is too late, before what is trapped in that ice finally breaks free. The project started innocently enough. We were installing acoustic monitoring equipment deep inside the glacier to study ice movement and calving patterns. Glaciers make noise constantly, creaking and groaning as they shift, cracking as air bubbles compress, booming when chunks break away. It is a symphony of natural sounds that scientists have been recording for decades. But what we picked up on our instruments wasn't natural. It wasn't anything close to natural. The first anomaly appeared on our monitors 3 days into the installation. High-frequency sounds, way beyond the range of human hearing, pulsing from somewhere deep in the ice. My colleague Dr. James Chen thought it was equipment malfunction at first, interference from our drilling operations or electrical noise in the cables. But the pattern was too regular, too structured. It repeated every 47 seconds, a burst of ultrasonic energy that our computers flagged as statistically impossible for random glacier activity. I made the decision to investigate personally. The ice caves of Mendenhall extend for miles into the glacier, a network of tunnels carved by meltwater streams, constantly shifting and reforming. They were beautiful and deadly, with walls of blue ice so clear you can see hundreds of feet into the frozen depths, and ceilings that can collapse without warning. Most tourists only see the shallow entrance caves. We were going deep, into sections that had never been explored, following the source of those disturbing sounds. The temperature dropped as we descended. The shallow caves hover around freezing, but deeper in, the ice gets colder, denser, harder than concrete. My breath crystallized instantly in the air, and the cold penetrated my thermal gear, making my bones ache. The walls glowed with an eerie blue light, the color of deep ocean water, and the silence was absolute except for our footsteps crunching on the ancient ice and the steady drip of meltwater that never quite froze. We found the source about a mile in a chamber that shouldn't have existed according to our radar scans. The ice walls here were different, filled with strange dark shapes frozen in the glacier like insects in amber. At first, I thought they were just rocks or debris, sediment picked up as the glacier flowed down from the mountains. But then I looked closer, and the horror of what I was seeing made my stomach clench with fear. They were human, or had been human, dozens of figures frozen in the ice, their bodies twisted in positions of absolute agony, their faces locked in expressions of terror that had lasted over a century. Their clothes were old, 19th century prospector gear, the kind worn by gold rush miners. But it was their positions that were most disturbing. They weren't scattered randomly through the ice. They were arranged, positioned deliberately, all facing toward the center of the chamber, all reaching with outstretched hands toward something I couldn't quite see. That's when the screaming started, not through the air, but through the ice itself, vibrations that resonated through the walls and floor, that I could feel in my teeth and bones before I could hear them. Our equipment went crazy, needles jumping, readings spiking off the charts. And when James played the recording back through our computer, slowing down the ultrasonic frequencies to bring them into human hearing range, we heard it clearly. A voice, distorted and ancient and filled with desperate, terrifying need. Let me out, let me out, let me out. The words repeated over and over, each repetition slightly different, the tone shifting between pleading and demanding, between human and something else, something that had been frozen for so long it had forgotten how to be a person. The voice came from the center of the chamber, from a section of ice that looked darker than the rest, almost black, like a void in the glacier. His heart. I should have left immediately. Every instinct, every bit of training and common sense told me to get out of that cave and seal it forever. But scientific curiosity is a powerful thing, and I needed to know what was at the center of that chamber. What could possibly create sounds like that? What those frozen prospectors had been reaching for. We used thermal imaging equipment to map the dark section, and what appeared on our screens made no sense. There was heat coming from inside the ice, a warm spot deep in the glacier where everything should be frozen solid. The temperature differential was impossible, violating basic thermodynamics. Something was generating warmth, had been generating it for over 100 years, slowly melting the ice from within. James set up a core drill, a specialized tool designed to extract cylindrical samples of ice without contaminating them. We positioned it carefully, aiming for the center of the heat source, and started drilling. The bit cut through the ice smoothly at first, sending up a spray of fine ice crystals that glittered in our headlamp beams. Then, about 30 feet in, it hit something. Not rock, not metal, something soft and yielding that made a sound like tearing fabric when the drill punched through. The smell hit us first. A wave of rot and decay that was impossible given the freezing temperatures, mixed with something else, something chemical and raw that made my eyes water and my throat close up. The drill was stuck, the bit caught in whatever it had penetrated, and when James tried to reverse it, something came out with it. Something that looked like flesh, gray and mottled, but moving, pulsing, alive despite being encased in ice for over a century. The screaming intensified. Now it was everywhere, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, vibrating through the entire glacier. And it wasn't just one voice anymore. Dozens of voices, hundreds maybe, all screaming the same 3 words in perfect unison. Let me out. The frozen prospectors in the walls seemed to move, their reaching hands straining toward us, their mouths opening impossibly wide in silent screams that matched the ones echoing through the ice. That is when the ice around us started to crack. Not randomly, but in patterns, in lines that spread from the dark center like a spider web, like something was pushing from the inside, testing the strength of its prison. James grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the exit tunnel, and we ran, our equipment forgotten, our scientific objectivity replaced by pure, primal terror. Behind us, the chamber began to collapse. I looked back once and saw it, something emerging from the dark ice, something that had once been human but had changed during its century of frozen imprisonment, that had evolved or mutated or transformed into something else. It was tall and impossibly thin, its skin the color of glacial ice, its eyes black holes that reflected our headlamps like mirrors. And it was reaching for us with hands that had too many fingers, with arms that stretched further than arms should reach. We made it out, barely. The tunnel collapsed behind us, sealing the chamber and whatever was inside. We reported everything to our superiors, gave them the recordings, the thermal images, the core sample that was still pulsing with unnatural life in its containment tube. The project was shut down within hours. The area was declared off limits, too dangerous for further exploration. Our findings were classified, our evidence confiscated. But here is what keeps me awake every night, what makes me monitor seismic activity around Juneau with obsessive fear. Glaciers melt. Climate change is accelerating that process. Mendenhall Glacier is retreating at a rate of about 300 feet per year, exposing ice that has been frozen for millennia. And that chamber, that dark heart where something screamed to be released, it is getting closer to the surface with each passing season. I've done the calculations. At current melt rates, that section of the glacier will be exposed to open air in about 8 years. Maybe less if we have a hot summer. And whatever is trapped inside, whatever transformed those prospectors into frozen sentinels, whatever learned to survive and think and scream after a century of ice, it will be free. The disturbing part is that the screaming hasn't stopped. Other research teams, tourists, even pilots flying over the glacier have reported hearing it, that same ultrasonic frequency, that same desperate plea. Let me out. And it's getting louder each year, more insistent, more angry. As if it knows its prison is weakening, as if it can taste freedom getting closer. I've tried to warn people. I've contacted government agencies, written papers that were immediately suppressed, even tried to go public before lawyers and non-disclosure agreements shut me down. Nobody wants to hear that there's something ancient and terrifying trapped in one of Alaska's most popular tourist attractions. Something that is counting down the years until it can emerge into a world that is completely unprepared for what it is become. Sometimes I dream about it. I am back in that chamber, watching those frozen prospectors reach toward the darkness, and I understand finally what they were trying to do. They weren't trying to reach the thing in the ice. They were trying to hold it back, to keep it contained, and they sacrificed themselves, let the glacier take them, turn themselves into a living barrier between that thing and the world above. But their sacrifice is running out of time. The ice that held them, that gave their deaths meaning, is melting away. And when it is gone, when that thing finally breaks free and takes its first breath of modern air, what will it do? What does a creature that has been frozen alive, screaming into the void for over 100 years, want with our world? I moved away from Alaska 6 months ago. I couldn't wake up every morning knowing what was waiting in that glacier, knowing that I'd drilled into its prison and given it hope that freedom was possible. But distance doesn't help. I still hear the screaming sometimes, faint and distant but unmistakable, carried on the wind from thousands of miles away, as if that thing in the ice has formed a connection with everyone who has heard its voice, everyone who knows its secret. The recordings we made are still out there somewhere, locked in a government facility, evidence of something that shouldn't to exist but does. I have copies, of course, stored in multiple secure locations, my insurance policy against being silenced. And sometimes, late at night, I play them back, listening to that voice beg and demand and threaten, trying to understand what it is, what it wants, what it will become when the ice finally releases it. The frequency analysis reveals patterns in the screaming, structures that suggest intelligence, maybe even language. It's not just screaming. It's trying to communicate, to tell us something important, something we need to know before it is free. But the message is encrypted in harmonics and overtones that human ears weren't designed to interpret. We need years of analysis to decode it, years we might not have. So here is my question for you, and I need your honest answer. If you knew something ancient and dangerous was about to be released from its frozen prison, something that has been screaming to be freed for over a century, would you try to stop it, or would you accept that some forces are too powerful, too inevitable to resist? Write your answer in the comments, because I genuinely don't know what to do anymore. I've warned everyone I can, but nobody is listening. And in 8 years, maybe less, that thing in the ice is going to prove that I was right, and by then it will be far too late to stop it. Story 5. Fog that remembers. What if the thing pretending to be someone you love knows exactly what to say to make you follow it into the darkness? I am a nurse at Ketchikan General Hospital in Southeast Alaska, and over the past 8 months, they treated 17 cases of severe frostbite in people who should have known better. Locals that lived here their entire lives, people who understand hypothermia and exposure like they understand breathing. They all tell the same story, the same terrifying account that sounds like madness until you see the fear in their eyes and realize they retelling the truth. They followed someone into the fog, someone they loved, someone who's been dead for years. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I am about to tell you why I'm leaving Alaska forever, why I can no longer walk the streets of my own town after dark, and why the fog that rolls through Creek Street isn't natural. It is hunting, and it knows things about you that nothing living should ever know. Creek Street is the historic heart of Ketchikan, a boardwalk built on pilings over Ketchikan Creek, lined with old wooden buildings that once served as brothels during the Gold Rush era. It is a tourist attraction now, full of gift shops and galleries, charming in daylight but unsettling after dark when the fog rolls in from the water. And the fog here is different, thicker, more purposeful, like it is watching you with invisible eyes. The first case came into my emergency room on a freezing November night. A woman in her 60s named Patricia Dunn, found wandering 15 miles outside town, hypothermic and confused, her fingers black with frostbite. She kept saying she'd been following her husband down Creek Street, her husband who died of a heart attack 3 years earlier. She said he appeared in the fog, smiling at her, telling her he needed to show her something important. She followed him for what she thought was 5 minutes. 7 hours had passed. I assumed it was early dementia, maybe a psychotic break triggered by grief. But then more cases arrived. A fisherman who followed his drowned brother, a teacher who followed her childhood best friend, a teenager who followed her grandmother. All of them found miles from where they started, all with severe frostbite, all telling stories about the fog taking human shape and leading them into the wilderness. The disturbing pattern became clear. The fog only appeared as people who were dead, people the victims had loved and lost. And it knew intimate details about these relationships, private memories and inside jokes that nobody else could possibly know. It wasn't just mimicking appearances. It was reaching into minds and pulling out the most painful losses, then using them as bait. I started researching the history of Creek Street, looking for explanations. What I found made my blood run cold. There were records going back to the 1920s of similar disappearances. People vanishing into the fog and turning up miles away, frozen and babbling about seeing the dead. Some never turned up at all. The old-timers called it the remembering fog, said it was angry spirits from the creek, souls of people who died in the water over the decades, trapped and looking for company in their cold darkness. But I am a woman of science. I don't believe in spirits or ghosts or supernatural fog. At least, I didn't. Not until 3 weeks ago when I saw my daughter in the fog. My daughter Emily, who died in a car accident when she was 16, 5 years ago. I was working a late shift, walking home around midnight down Creek Street. The fog had rolled in thick and gray, reducing visibility to maybe 10 feet. The streetlights created halos of diffused light that barely penetrated the murk. I could hear the creek below, rushing cold and black beneath the boardwalk, and the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the old wooden buildings. Then I heard her voice. Emily, this voice, calling my name from somewhere ahead in the fog. Not scared, not urgent, just casual and sweet like she used to sound when she wanted to show me something. Mom, come look at this. Mom, you have to see. My rational mind screamed that this wasn't real, that Emily was dead and buried, that this was the same thing that had happened to all my patients. But my heart, my desperate, grieving heart that still ached for her every single day, refused to listen. I started walking toward the voice. She appeared in the fog like a photograph coming into focus. My beautiful girl, exactly as I remembered her, 16 forever, wearing the same jacket she died in, smiling that crooked smile that used to light up my entire world. She looked so real, so solid, so alive that tears immediately blurred my vision. She told me she'd been waiting for me, that she had something important to show me by the water. She turned and started walking deeper into the fog, and I followed. Every instinct I had screamed danger, but the need to be near her again, even if it was impossible, even if it was insane, was stronger than fear. We walked for what felt like minutes but must have been longer. The boardwalk ended and we moved onto a dirt path I didn't recognize. The fog grew thicker, pressing against my skin like something solid and cold. Emily stayed just ahead of me, always at the edge of visibility, always beckoning me forward with that smile. I'd do anything to see one more time. Then she said something that made me stop cold. She mentioned a secret I'd never told anyone, something that happened between us the week before she died, a conversation we had late at night when she was scared about something. There was no way anyone else could know about that moment. It was private, locked in my memory, mine alone. That's when I realized the horrifying truth. This thing wasn't just taking shapes from my mind. It was inside my head, rifling through my memories like files in a drawer, pulling out the most intimate and painful moments to make itself more convincing. It knew everything about Emily because it could see everything I remembered about her. The fog around me started to shift and move, forming other shapes. I saw my father who died when I was 12, my college roommate who committed suicide, a patient I couldn't save during my first year as a nurse. All of them emerging from the gray murk, all of them smiling, all of them reaching toward me with cold hands that weren't quite solid. Emily, his face changed. The smile remained, but her eyes went black, completely black, like holes in her face. She spoke again, but her voice had changed, becoming a chorus of voices speaking in unison, the voices of everyone I ever lost all talking at once. Come with us, they said. Stay in the fog. Become part of the cold. They've been waiting so long. I turned and ran. The fog seemed to fight me, becoming thick as water, pressing against my body like invisible hands trying to hold me back. I couldn't see the boardwalk, couldn't see anything but gray and shapes moving in the gray and those black eyes watching me from every direction. I ran blindly, crashing through brush, falling and scrambling back up, my lungs burning with the frigid air. Behind me, I could hear Emily calling my name, but her voice was wrong now, mechanical and hollow, like a recording played through broken speakers. Other voices joined in, all the dead I'd known, all of them calling me back into the fog. I don't remember how I escaped. I woke up in my own front yard, 12 miles from Creek Street, with no memory of getting there. My hands and feet were numb with cold, my clothes soaked through. I'd been missing for 9 hours. If a neighbor hadn't found me, I would have frozen to death right there on my own lawn. The hospital treated me for mild frostbite and exposure. My colleagues gave me the same concerned looks I'd given my patients, the same professional skepticism mixed with pity. They thought I had a breakdown, that grief had finally broken me. Maybe they were right, but the thing is, I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that thing in the fog knew details about my daughter that nobody living could possibly know. Since that night, 4 more people have been brought to my emergency room with the same symptoms. All locals, all with stories about the fog showing them dead loved ones, and the cases are getting worse. The victims are being found farther from town, in more remote locations, with more severe frostbite. 2 of them lost fingers to amputation. 1 lost both feet. Whatever lives in that fog is getting bolder, more aggressive. It is not content to just lure people away anymore. It wants to keep them, wants to add them to whatever collection of souls that is gathered over the decades. And it is learning. Each victim reports that the apparitions are more convincing, more detailed, harder to distinguish from real memories. I've tried warning people. They'd talk to the mayor, to the police, to anyone who will all listen. But how do you warn a town about intelligent fog that hunts by wearing the faces of the dead? They think I'm crazy. Hell, maybe I am. But I know what I saw in the fog that night, and I know it's still out there, still waiting, still hunting. Last week, I put my house up for sale. I am leaving Ketchikan as soon as I can pack my life into boxes and drive away. But the terrifying thing is, I'm not sure distance will matter. Because 3 nights ago, I woke up at 3 a.m. to see fog pressing against my bedroom window. Thick gray fog that had no business being on the 3rd floor of a building. And in that fog, I saw Emily's face, black eyes staring at me through the glass. Her mouth moving in words I couldn't to hear but somehow understood. "You can't leave us," she was saying. "You belong in the cold now. We will follow you wherever you go." The fog is spreading beyond Creek Street now. It appears in neighborhoods, in parking lots, even inside buildings when the conditions are right. More people are seeing their dead loved ones. More people are following shapes into the gray murk. And I am terrified that what started as something localized to one haunted boardwalk is becoming something bigger. Something that is spreading like an infection through the entire town. I don't know what the fog really is. Maybe it's spirits. Maybe it is something else. Something that existed here long before humans arrived. Something that learned to take shapes from our minds to lure us to our deaths. All I know is it is real, it is dangerous, and it knows the deepest wounds in your heart. So here is my question for you. If someone you loved and lost appeared in the fog tomorrow, looking exactly as you remember them, saying exactly what you long to hear them say one more time, would you have the strength to turn away? Or would you follow them into the cold gray nothing, knowing it's probably a trap, but hoping, desperately hoping, that maybe this time death got it wrong? Write your answer in the comments, because I'm still not sure what I'd do if I saw Emily in the fog again tonight. Story 6. Signal. Have you ever wondered what happens when something watches you through the screen instead of the other way around? In 1971, someone in Alaska found out, and what they discovered was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. I never believed in the old stories until I inherited my grandfather's cabin outside Anchorage. The place had been sitting empty since he died in 1998, and my family always found excuses not to deal with it. Too remote, they said. Too many bad memories. But I needed somewhere cheap to stay while I worked contract jobs on the North Slope oil fields, and a free cabin in the Alaskan wilderness seemed like a gift. That was my first mistake. Ignoring the fear in my mother's eyes when I told her my plans was my second. The cabin sat 30 miles outside Anchorage, accessible only by a logging road that hadn't been maintained in decades. My truck barely made it through the snow and mud. When I finally saw the place through the trees, something inside me went cold. The structure looked solid enough, built from dark timber that had weathered countless brutal winters, but every window was covered from the inside with what looked like aluminum foil. Not just covered, sealed. Someone had taped and stapled layer after layer of foil across every single pane of glass, blocking out the world completely. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes before I found the courage to go inside. The interior was exactly as my grandfather had left it. Dusty furniture arranged with military precision. Canned goods lined up in perfect rows in the kitchen, and in the corner of the main room, facing the wall, sat an old console television from the early 70s. Someone had unplugged it and turned it to face away from the rest of the space, like they couldn't stand to look at it anymore. The screen was covered in more aluminum foil, and someone had written a single word across it in black marker that had faded to gray over the decades. The word was simple, chilling, and made no sense to me then. Done. I should have listened. The first few nights were uneventful. I cleaned the place, cleared away the foil from the windows to let in some light, and tried to make the cabin livable. The isolation was intense. No cell signal, no internet, no neighbors for miles, just the endless Alaskan wilderness pressing in from all sides. The darkness up there is different from anywhere else in America. It has weight, it has presence. And when winter comes early like it did that year, the darkness feels almost alive, hungry for something it lost a long time ago. On my 4th night, I found the box. It was hidden under the floorboards beneath the television, wrapped in a garbage bag and sealed with duct tape that had gone brittle with age. Inside were 3 VHS tapes, a journal, and a stack of newspaper clippings from 1971. The headlines made my skin crawl. Mystery broadcast interrupts Anchorage TV. Police investigate illegal signal intrusion. Search in Gakona Mountains yields no results. But it was the journal that changed everything. My grandfather, his handwriting, usually so neat and controlled, had deteriorated into frantic scratches across the pages. The entries started normally enough. He described working as a technician for the local television station in Anchorage. Routine maintenance, signal checks, nothing unusual. Then came November 12, 1971. That was the night the broadcast happened. The night that, according to these yellowed newspaper clippings, had become a local legend. An unexplained signal intrusion during the evening news. 3 minutes of static and shadow. A figure in a dark room. A pointing finger. Then nothing. But my grandfather, his journal told a different story. A terrifying story that the newspapers had never printed. He had been alone at the station when the signal cut in. He described the horror of watching the feed replace the news broadcast, powerless to stop it. The figure in the darkness wasn't just pointing at the camera. It was pointing at him, specifically at him, through the camera, across the airwaves, into the control room where he sat frozen with fear. And in those 3 minutes before the signal died, he had seen something in the static surrounding that figure. Faces, dozens of faces pressed against darkness like people drowning behind glass. Their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes reflecting light that had no source. The journal entry ended with a single line written so hard the pen had torn through the paper. "It knows where I live." I read those words by lamplight, and the cabin suddenly felt smaller, darker, more vulnerable than it had moments before. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows I had uncovered. Or maybe it wasn't the wind. Maybe it was something else, something that had been waiting decades for someone to remove those protective layers of foil and let it see inside again. That night, I had the first dream. I stood in a dark room that I somehow knew was underground, buried deep in the mountains. Old broadcasting equipment lined the walls, covered in decades of dust and decay. Cables snaked across the floor like dead things, and in the center of the room stood a television on a metal stand, its screen glowing with pale static light. As I watched, unable to move or look away, a figure began to form in that static. Tall, thin, wrong in proportions that my sleeping mind couldn't quite process. It turned toward me slowly, and I saw that where its face should have been there was only more darkness, deeper darkness, the kind that exists in places where light has never reached. Then it pointed. I woke up screaming, tangled in blankets soaked with cold sweat. 3 a.m, the darkest part of the Alaskan night, and from the living room came a sound that turned my blood to ice. A soft electrical hum. The television was on. I hadn't plugged it in. I was certain I hadn't plugged it in. But pale light flickered around the doorframe, painting strange shadows on the bedroom wall. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in bed, to hide under the covers like a child, to pretend I heard nothing. But I was 38 years old, a grown man, and grown men believe in monsters. So I forced myself out of bed and walked toward that terrible light. The television sat exactly where my grandfather had left it, but now it faced into the room. The screen showed nothing but static, but it was the wrong kind of static. Modern digital static is uniform, predictable. This was analog chaos, the kind that hasn't existed since everything went digital. And in that chaos, if I looked at it from the corner of my eye, I could almost see patterns, almost see movement, almost see faces pressed against the glass from the inside, trying desperately to get out. I pulled the plug from the wall. The screen went dark immediately, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. Something in that cabin had woken up, and unplugging a television wasn't going to put it back to sleep. The next morning, I drove into Anchorage and went straight to the Historical Society. If my grandfather's journal was real, if the 1971 signal intrusion had actually happened the way he described, then someone else had to remember. Someone had to know more than the newspaper articles revealed. The woman at the desk was in her 70s, old enough to have been alive when it happened. When I mentioned the broadcast, her face went pale. She told me things that weren't in any newspaper. How people reported nightmares for weeks after seeing the broadcast. How 3 television station employees had quit their jobs the next day and left Alaska entirely. How my grandfather had become obsessed with finding the source of the signal, spending months hiking through the Gakona Mountains despite the dangerous winter conditions. and how he had eventually found something up there, something that had changed him forever. She didn't. Do you know what he found? He never told anyone, but when he came back down from the mountains that last time, he had sold his house in Anchorage, bought the isolated cabin, and spent the rest of his life hiding from something no one else could see. He covered his windows. He turned his television to face the wall. And according to neighbors who occasionally checked on him, he would sometimes wake up screaming about static and pointing fingers and faces behind glass. The woman at the Historical Society gave me one more piece of information before I left. My grandfather wasn't the only one. Over the decades since 1971, at least a dozen people in the Anchorage area had reported similar experiences. Televisions turning on by themselves, strange figures in the static during winter storms, the feeling of being watched through screens. And all of them had one thing in common. They had all tried to find the source of the original broadcast. They had all gone looking in the mountains. And they had all come back changed, haunted, convinced that something up there was still broadcasting, still trying to reach through the static into our world. I should have left Alaska that day. I should have driven straight to the airport and never looked back. But something kept me at the cabin. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the same obsession that had consumed my grandfather. Or maybe it was something else. Something that had already gotten its hooks into me through that television screen, through those dreams, through the static that seemed to follow me now even when no screens were nearby. That night, I read the rest of my grandfather's journal. The later entries were almost incomprehensible, written in the weeks before he sealed up the windows and turned the television away forever. He described finding an old bunker in the mountains, a forgotten Cold War installation that the military had abandoned in the 50s. Someone had set up broadcasting equipment down there decades ago. Someone had been transmitting from that underground darkness for years, maybe decades, before the 1971 intrusion that made the news. And they were still transmitting, sending out their signal into the night, waiting for someone to tune in and see what they had become. The last entry was dated 3 days before he sealed up the cabin. Just 4 words, written so many times they covered the entire page. The same 4 words over and over until the page was black with ink and terror. It followed me home. I put the journal down with shaking hands. The cabin felt different now, like I was seeing it clearly for the first time. Not as a refuge, but as a trap. Not as a home, but as a cage, built by a man who knew something was hunting him and thought walls and aluminum foil might keep it out. And I was living in that same cage now, sleeping in that same bed, breathing that same air thick with decades of fear. The television turned on again at 3 a.m. This time I didn't bother unplugging it. I stood in the doorway and watched the static swirl and pulse on the screen. And this time, I saw them clearly. The faces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pressed against the inside of the screen like prisoners behind glass, their features distorted by the medium that held them captive. Some looked recent, their expressions still sharp with terror and confusion. Others had decayed into vague suggestions of humanity, worn smooth by decades of existence in that electrical limbo. And then I saw him, my grandfather, younger than I remembered, but unmistakably him. His face appeared in the center of the screen, mouth moving in words I couldn't hear. He was trying to warn me, trying to tell me something crucial, but the static was too thick, the signal too degraded, and all I could hear was the soft electrical hum and the wind outside growing stronger. The figure appeared behind my grandfather in the static. The same impossible figure from my dreams. Tall and wrong and made of deeper darkness. It reached forward with something that might have been hands, and my grandfather, his face contorted in silent horror. Then both of them receded into the static, pulled back into whatever terrible place existed behind the screen, and I understood. I finally understood what my grandfather had found in those mountains. The bunker wasn't abandoned. The equipment wasn't unmanned. Something down there was still broadcasting, still transmitting its signal out into the dark Alaskan winter. And everyone who went looking for it, everyone who got too close to the truth, got pulled into the broadcast. They became part of the signal, part of the static, forever trapped in that electrical darkness, their faces pressed against screens all across Alaska, trying desperately to warn others away while simultaneously serving as bait to lure more victims in. The television turned itself off. I stood in the darkness of the cabin, my mind racing. I could leave. I should leave, pack up right now and drive back to Anchorage, fly south to the lower 48, and never think about Alaska again. But I knew it wouldn't matter. My grandfather had tried to run. He had built this cage and lived in it for decades, but it had found him anyway, pulled him into the static, eventually added his face to the collection behind the glass. Running wouldn't save me. The signal had already reached me. It knew where I was. It had been watching me through every screen I passed, waiting for the right moment to pull me in. There was only one option left. I had to go to the source. I had to find that bunker in the Gakona mountains and destroy whatever was broadcasting from that darkness. It was insane. It was probably suicide, but it was the only way to end this, to free my grandfather and all the others trapped in that terrible place between transmission and reception. I left the next morning, following the maps and notes from my grandfather, this journal. The drive took 6 hours, the last 3 on roads that barely qualified as trails. The bunker entrance was exactly where he had marked it, hidden behind rockfall and dense brush at the base of a steep valley. The metal door hung open, revealing concrete steps descending into absolute darkness. I had brought flashlights, rope, and a container of gasoline. If I couldn't to stop the broadcast, I would burn it. I would bury it. I would do whatever it took to silence that signal forever. The bunker went deeper than I expected. Room after room of old military equipment, all of it covered in rust and decay. But in the deepest chamber, the equipment looked newer. Someone had been maintaining it. Someone had been keeping the broadcast alive for decades. Generators hummed in the corner, powered by something I couldn't identify. Cables ran everywhere, connecting ancient analog broadcasting equipment to modern digital converters. And in the center of it all sat a television, its screen glowing with that familiar static. As I approached, faces began to appear. My grandfather, the station employees, dozens of others I didn't recognize. All of them trying to warn me, their silent screams forming patterns in the static. And then the figure appeared, the tall, wrong thing made of darkness and hunger. It moved through the screen like water through glass, emerging into the physical world with a sound like tearing paper and breaking bone. I ran, not toward the exit, but toward the broadcasting equipment. If I couldn't stop it, I would destroy its way into our world. I poured gasoline over the generators, the converters, the cables. The figure behind me moved closer, and I could feel its presence like ice against my spine. But I had time, just barely, just enough. I lit the match. The explosion knocked me backward, and I crawled toward the exit as flames consumed the bunker behind me. The figure's scream was silent, but I felt it in my bones, in my teeth, in every cell of my body. It was rage and hunger and something worse than either. It was the fury of something that had been feeding for decades, pulling people into the static one by one, and now felt its food source burning away to nothing. I made it outside as the bunker collapsed. Smoke poured from the entrance, thick and black and somehow wrong, like it contained more than just burning material. I drove away without looking back, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the wheel. That was 3 months ago. I had been back to Alaska. I sold the cabin without ever setting foot in it again. I try not to watch television anymore. Try not to look at screens when I don't have to. But sometimes, late at night when storms knock out the cable and fill my TV with static, I see faces in the snow. Familiar faces now. My grandfather isn't among them anymore. I think I freed him. I hope I freed him. But sometimes I wonder if I destroyed the broadcast or just broke its anchor to our world. Sometimes I wonder if it is still out there, still transmitting from some other bunker or station or dark place between the mountains. And sometimes, when the static gets really thick, I see something that terrifies me more than anything else. My own face, looking back at me from the screen, mouth open in a silent warning. Already starting to fade into the endless gray. Already becoming part of the signal that never truly dies, that just waits for the next person to tune in, to listen, to look too closely at the static and see what is waiting behind the glass. Because here is the thing about signals. They don't just disappear. They echo. They bounce around the atmosphere forever, getting weaker but never quite dying. And somewhere out there in the dark, that broadcast is still happening. Those faces are still pressed against screens, waiting for someone to see them. And the figure is still pointing, always pointing, choosing its next victim from everyone who dares to look too long at the static between channels. So if you ever in Alaska during a winter storm, and your television fills with snow, do yourself a favor. Don't look too closely. Don't try to see the patterns. And if you see a face in the static, if you see someone pointing at you through the screen, turn it off immediately. Some signals are meant to be ignored. Some broadcasts should never be received. And some things that wait in the darkness between transmission and reception are better left unwatched, unseen, and forgotten. But they never forget you. Story 7. Storm is guest. I found the tapes in a place that shouldn't exist anymore. Teller, Alaska, a ghost town perched on the edge of the Bering Sea, where the wind screams across empty streets and the buildings lean like broken teeth. I was there doing survey work for an oil company, documenting abandoned structures before the permafrost swallowed them whole. The kind of job that pays well because nobody else wants to spend 3 weeks in a place where darkness lasts 20 hours a day and the cold can kill you in minutes. The house stood apart from the others, not collapsed like the rest, but perfectly intact, as if someone had just stepped out for groceries. The door hung open. Inside, everything was frozen in time. A calendar on the wall showed December 1993. Dishes in the sink. A child, his coat draped over a chair. And in the bedroom closet, underneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets, I found them. 17 VHS tapes, each one labeled with dates spanning 3 weeks in January 1994. The labels were written in a shaky hand, the ink smudged. The last tape had no label at all, just a dark stain across the plastic case that looked disturbingly like a fingerprint pressed in blood. I should have left them there. Should have walked away and never looked back. But curiosity is a hungry thing, and in the endless Alaskan darkness, it feeds on isolation and boredom. I brought them back to my heated trailer and dug out an old VHS player I'd seen in the company supply shed. The first tape started with static, then resolved into a living room. The timestamp in the corner read January 3rd, 1994. A man appeared on screen, maybe 40 years old, with a thick beard and kind eyes. He was filming what looked like a family dinner. A woman with blonde hair pulled into a ponytail. 2 kids, a boy and a girl, maybe 8 and 10. They were laughing, normal, happy. Storm is coming, the man said from behind the camera. His voice had that distinctive Alaskan drawl, stretched out and relaxed. Weather Service says it's going to be a big one. 3, maybe 4 days of whiteout conditions. The woman smiled at the camera. We ready. Got enough food to last a month. Right? Kids. The children cheered. The boy held up a can of beans like a trophy. The girl was drawing something at the table, her tongue poking out in concentration. Everything about the scene was warm, safe, the kind of ordinary family moment that makes you feel nostalgic for a life you that never lived. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl even on that first viewing. In the corner of the frame, just beyond the kitchen doorway, there was a shadow. Not a normal shadow cast by the overhead light, but something darker, denser. It didn't move like shadows should. It seemed to pulse, like it was breathing. I rewound the tape and watched again. The shadow was still there. In every shot where the camera panned toward that doorway, that same dark shape lingered just out of focus. I told myself it was a trick of the old footage, compression artifacts from decades-old magnetic tape. But deep down, in that primitive part of the brain that still remembers what it's like to be prey, I knew better. The second tape showed the storm, its arrival. The wind howled like something alive and furious. Snow piled against the windows in drifts that reached halfway up the glass. The father had moved the camera to a tripod, filming the family as they played board games by lamplight. The power had gone out, he explained. No big deal. They had a generator and plenty of fuel. But the mood had shifted. The children weren't laughing anymore. They kept glancing toward the windows, toward the doors. The mother's smile looked forced, painted on. And in every single shot, that shadow was there, sometimes in the corner, sometimes behind furniture. Once, horrifyingly, it seemed to be standing directly behind the little girl, so close that it should have been touching her. Nobody in the footage acknowledged it. Nobody looked at it or spoke about it. But I could see the fear creeping into their faces, settling into the tight lines around their eyes and mouths. The third tape was where things started to break down. January 7th, 4 days into the storm. The father, his hands shook as he adjusted the camera. His voice had changed, become thin and reedy. To get through to anyone. Radio was dead. Satellite phone won. T-Connect. It's just the storm. That's all. Just the storm. But he didn't sound like he believed it. The footage showed the family eating dinner in silence. The children pushed food around their plates without eating. The mother stared at something off camera, her eyes wide and glassy. And then, as the father panned across the room, the camera caught something that made my breath stop in my throat. A handprint on the window, pressed against the glass from the outside, but they were on the second floor. I paused the tape and leaned closer to my screen. The handprint was enormous, easily twice the size of a normal human hand. The fingers were too long, the proportions all wrong, and around it, the frost on the window had melted in a perfect outline, as if something impossibly warm had touched the freezing glass. The tapes continued to deteriorate after that, not in quality but in content. The family fell apart in slow motion, captured in grainy analog footage that felt more real than any high-definition image ever could. January 10th, the boy refused to sleep. He sat in the corner of his room, rocking back and forth, staring at the closet door. The father filmed him with the camera, his night vision, the green-tinted image making everything look alien and wrong. "It talks to me," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm's roar. "It says it's cold out there. It says it wants to come in." January 12th, the mother had stopped speaking entirely. She sat at the kitchen table, motionless, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes tracked something moving through the house, following its path from room to room. But whenever the father pointed the camera where she was looking, there was nothing there. Just empty space in that persistent, breathing shadow. January 14th, the girl's tape. She'd taken the camera into her room and filmed herself whispering into the lens. "Daddy won. To listen. Mommy won. To talk. But I see it. I see it every night. It stands at the end of my bed and watches me. It's so tall it has to bend down to fit under the ceiling. It doesn't have a face, just darkness where a face should be. And it's getting closer every night." She was 10 years old. Her voice was steady, matter of fact, the way children can be when they haven, to yet learn that adults want to believe them. Then she turned the camera toward her bed, panning slowly across the room. For a moment, there was nothing. Just a child, this bedroom, stuffed animals on the shelf, posters on the wall. Then the camera caught it, standing in the corner, perfectly still. A figure so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a void in the shape of something impossibly tall and thin. The camera's autofocus struggled, trying and failing to resolve the image into something comprehensible. The girl turned the camera back to her face. She was crying silently, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I think it was hungry," she said. The tape cut to static. I sat in my trailer for a long time after that, listening to the wind outside. The same wind that howled through Teller. The same wind that had trapped that family in their home with something that shouldn't exist. My hands trembled as I loaded the next tape. The final tape showed the complete collapse. The father barely spoke anymore. He just filmed, documenting everything with the desperate precision of a man who knows nobody will believe him without proof. Proof of what? He seemed unsure, but he kept filming. January 16th, they started leaving food out. A plate set at the dinner table, the chair empty. "Maybe if we feed it'll leave us alone," the father muttered. His eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles. He looked like he'd aged 20 years in 2 weeks. The food never disappeared. It just sat there, meal after meal, growing cold while that shadow moved through the house like smoke, like something between solid and liquid, present and absent. January 18th, the storm should have ended days ago, but it hadn't. It was still raging outside, the wind shrieking at frequencies that didn't sound quite natural. The father filmed the windows, where the snow had piled so high that the house was buried. They were entombed in ice and darkness, cut off from the world. "I think it brought the storm," he said quietly. "I think it rode in on the wind and now it won to leave. Won, let us leave." The children had stopped moving almost entirely. They sat wherever they were placed, staring at nothing, occasionally turning their heads in unison to watch something invisible cross the room. The mother had started setting extra plates, not 1, but 3, 4, 5, as if more of them were arriving, as if the darkness was multiplying. Then came the last tape, the unlabeled one with the stain on the case. January 20th, according to the timestamp, 17 days after the storm began. The camera was set up in the dining room, pointed at the table. The family sat around it, all 4 of them, perfectly still, silent. Their eyes were open but empty, like they were looking at something 1,000 miles away. And there were other chairs pulled up to the table, 7 empty chairs, arranged in a circle around the family. And in those chairs, I could see it now. Not clearly, never clearly, but enough Shapes that suggested height and length and wrongness that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. Shadows given form and seated at the table like dinner guests. The father stood up slowly. He walked to the camera, his movements stiff and jerky, like a puppet on strings. His face filled the frame. His eyes were completely black, the pupils dilated so wide that no iris remained. "The storm brought guests," he said. His voice was wrong, layered with harmonics that shouldn't come from a human throat. "They were cold, so cold out there in the endless dark. We invited them in. We had to. You understand, Don? Do you? When something is that cold, that hungry, you have to let it in." "It's only polite." He smiled. His teeth were stained dark. "They were here now. They were always here, waiting in the cold places, the empty places, waiting for someone to open the door and let them in from the storm." The camera, its view tilted, falling to the side as if knocked over. The last image before the static was of that dining room, the family and their dark guests sitting in perfect stillness, and something moving across the floor toward the camera. Something that spread like oil, like liquid night, rushing forward to swallow the lens. Then nothing, just static and the sound of wind. I sat in the darkness of my trailer, the blue glow of the TV screen the only light. Outside, I could hear the Alaska wind picking up. Another storm was coming. The weather service had warned us. 3 days, maybe 4. Whiteout conditions. I tried to tell myself the tapes were fake. Had to be. Some elaborate hoax left behind in an abandoned house. But I checked. I looked up Teller's records. In January 1994, there had been a family living in that house. The Marshalls, David, Sarah, and their 2 children, Emma and Jacob. They'd been reported missing when the storm finally broke and neighbors found the house empty. No bodies, no blood, no sign of struggle, just an empty house with dishes in the sink and a child, his coat draped over a chair. The case had gone cold, listed as a probable exposure death, bodies lost in the storm. But now I knew better. They hadn't died in the storm. They invited something in from it. I packed up the tapes, put them in a box, labeled it with shaking hands. I planned to mail them to the authorities, to the Historical Society, to anyone who might understand what they meant. But that night, as the wind howled and the storm rolled in from the Bering Sea, I heard something outside my trailer. Footsteps in the snow, heavy, slow, circling the structure. I hadn't seen another person in 3 days. The rest of the crew had left when the weather warning came through. I was supposed to leave tomorrow, first thing in the morning. But the storm had come early. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I waited in the darkness, barely breathing. The wind screamed. Something scraped against the trailer. This metal wall, a sound like fingernails or claws dragging across steel. Then I heard it, a voice. No, multiple voices, speaking in unison. Men, women, children, all speaking the same words at the same time. "It's cold out here." A pause. The wind died for just a moment, creating a pocket of terrible silence. "Juan, did you let us in from the storm?" "I didn't." To answer, "I didn't move." I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the door, watching the handle slowly begin to turn even though I locked it. Even though I knew I locked it. "We were so cold," the voices said again. They've been waiting so long. Just open the door, just for a moment. Let us in." The handle turned further. The lock clicked. I grabbed my phone. No signal. The satellite link was down. Just like the Marshalls. Just like their radio and phone. The storm brought more than snow and wind. It brought interference, isolation. It brought guests. The door cracked open. Wind rushed in, carrying snow and darkness. And in that darkness, I saw shapes. Tall, too tall, bending down to fit through the doorway. Moving with that same liquid gray side, seen in the shadows on the tapes. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the camera I'd been using for the survey work. Started recording. If I was going to disappear like the Marshalls, like the company man who would find this trailer in the spring, at least there would be evidence. At least someone would know. The shapes moved into my trailer. I kept filming. My hands shook so badly that the footage would probably be useless, but I couldn't stop. I captured their approach, the way they seemed to flicker between visible and invisible, the way the temperature dropped so fast that my breath crystallized instantly in the air. They stood around me in a circle. 7 of them, maybe more, hard to count when they kept shifting, overlapping. their forms running together like watercolors in the rain. One of them leaned down. I felt its breath on my face, cold enough to burn. Smelled something ancient and wrong, like ozone and decay and emptiness. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once. Welcome to the storm. The camera's battery died. The last thing it recorded was darkness rushing in, and my own voice, distant and strange, saying words I didn't remember choosing to say. Yes, come in. I'll set an extra plate. They found my trailer 3 months later, when the spring thaw came. Found my equipment, my survey notes, my camera. The footage was corrupted, they said. Unrecoverable. Just static and the sound of wind. And one clear shot, right at the end, of a single footprint in the snow outside my door. It wasn't, to mine, too big, wrong proportions. The toes too long. They listed me as another exposure death, another casualty of the brutal Alaska winter. My body was never recovered, just like the marshals, just like all the others who disappeared in storms up there on the edge of the world. But I am still here, in the cold places, the empty places, waiting in the darkness between the wind and snow. And when the next storm comes, when someone finds themselves alone and isolated with the howling growing louder outside their door, they'll hear us. Knocking, patient, persistent. So cold out here, Juan, that you let us in from the storm? Story 8. Sound beneath Whittier. Have you ever heard your name whispered in the darkness by something that shouldn't? Do you know you exist? I am an urban explorer and photographer, someone who makes a living documenting abandoned places across America. I've crawled through condemned hospitals, explored forgotten prisons, walked the empty halls of bankrupt shopping malls. I thought I'd seen everything that could unsettle a person. Then I went to Whittier, Alaska, and discovered that some places aren't abandoned at all. They were just waiting. The town of Whittier is one of the strangest places in America. Nearly the entire population lives in a single building, a massive concrete tower left over from the Cold War. But beneath that building, beneath the whole town, there's a network of military tunnels built in the 1940s. Miles of concrete passages that once housed thousands of soldiers, now sitting empty and forgotten in the Alaskan darkness. The locals don't talk about the tunnels much. When they do, it's always with an edge of fear in their voices. They mention the whistling, a constant, melodic sound that echoes through the passages, rising and falling like a song without words. Nobody knows what causes it. Wind through cracks in the concrete, they say. Underground water flow. Natural acoustics doing strange things in enclosed spaces. But the people that explored those tunnels know better. They know the whistling isn't natural. And they know that if you follow it deep enough, you'll find something that has been waiting down there in the darkness for a very long time. I arrived in Whittier on a gray October morning, the kind of day where the sky and the sea blend together into one massive sheet of nothing. I'd been hired by an online magazine to photograph the abandoned military installations, get some creepy shots for their Halloween special. Easy money, I thought. Just another forgotten place with a scary reputation. I met my guide at the entrance to the tunnel system, an old service door half hidden behind the main residential building. His name was Derek, a local in his 50s who'd grown up in Whittier and knew the tunnels better than anyone. He had that weathered Alaska look, like the cold and isolation had carved lines into his face. But what I remember most were his eyes. They had a haunted quality, like he'd seen something he didn't see. He handed me a flashlight and a map, warning me that the tunnels were a maze. People had gotten lost down there before, wandered for hours in the darkness before finding their way out. Some passages led to dead ends, others to collapsed sections filled with rubble and freezing water. And some, he said with an unsettling pause, led to places that weren't on any map. The whistling started the moment we stepped inside, low and distant at first, like wind through a crack. But as we moved deeper into the tunnel system, it grew louder, more distinct. It had a melody to it, a tune that felt almost familiar, like a song I'd heard in childhood but couldn't quite remember. The sound wrapped around us in the darkness, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The tunnels were massive, 20-foot ceilings, walls thick enough to survive a nuclear blast, built when America was terrified of Soviet invasion. Our footsteps echoed off the concrete, mixing with that constant, eerie whistling. I started taking photographs, my camera flash cutting through the darkness in brief, blinding bursts that left purple after images in my vision. That's when I first saw the shadows. Not the normal shadows cast by our flashlights, but something else. Movement in the peripheral vision, shapes that seemed to slide along the walls just beyond the reach of our light. I told myself it was fatigue, my eyes playing tricks in the darkness. But Derek saw them too. I could tell by the way his hand tightened on his flashlight, the way his breathing got shallow and quick. We reached a section of tunnel that branched off in 3 directions. Derek checked his map, confusion crossing his face. He said this intersection wasn't supposed to be here, that the map showed a straight passage for another 100 yards. But there it was, 3 dark openings leading deeper into the underground complex, each one whistling with that haunting melody. I made the mistake of asking which way we should go. Derek, his response made my blood run cold. He said it didn't matter. The tunnels changed. Passages that were straight yesterday had corners today. Rooms that were empty last week were suddenly full of old military equipment that shouldn't be there. The tunnels were alive, he said, or something in them was. We chose the middle passage because it seemed wider, safer. The whistling grew louder as we walked, the melody becoming clearer. I could almost make out words in it, syllables hidden in the rising and falling notes. And then I heard it, my name, soft and distant, coming from somewhere ahead in the darkness. Not Derek's voice. Something else, something that sounded like a dozen voices speaking in perfect unison. I stopped walking. Derek grabbed my arm, telling me not to respond, not to acknowledge it in any way. He said the tunnels call to people. Use their names. Try to lure them deeper into passages that don't appear on maps. Explorers who followed the voices were found days later, hypothermic and babbling about shadows that moved like people, about rooms that shouldn't exist, about something ancient living in the deepest parts of the tunnel system. But I couldn't help myself. I am a skeptic by nature, someone who needs to see proof before believing. So when I heard my name again, clearer this time, coming from a side passage to our left, I turned toward it. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and it sloped downward into darkness that seemed thicker than normal, like the shadows there were made of something solid. Derek tried to stop me, but I pulled away. I told him I just wanted to look, just wanted to see what was down there. The whistling was so loud now it made my teeth ache, and underneath it, I could hear footsteps. Multiple sets, walking in rhythm, coming closer. I stepped into the side passage. My flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed by the darkness, barely illuminating 10 feet ahead. The walls were different here, older somehow, covered in a thin layer of frost that shouldn't exist this far from the surface. And there were marks on the walls, scratches, hundreds of them, carved deep into the concrete, forming patterns that hurt to look at. The footsteps stopped, the whistling changed pitch, becoming something almost like laughter. And then I saw them, shadows at the edge of my light, standing in a group, watching me. They had human shapes but wrong proportions, too tall and too thin, with movements that were jerky and unnatural. And they were getting closer. I turned to run back to the main tunnel, but the passage behind me was different. Longer. The entrance I'd come through was gone, replaced by more tunnels stretching into darkness. Derek, his voice called out my name, but it sounded distant, muffled, like he was on the other side of a thick wall. The shadow figures moved faster. I could hear them now, a scraping sound like nails on concrete, mixed with breathing that was too deep and too slow to be human. I ran, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode. I found a door, an old metal door marked with faded military stenciling. I yanked it open and stumbled through, slamming it shut behind me. The room beyond was small, maybe 10 feet square, filled with ancient radio equipment and filing cabinets. But what caught my attention was the wall. It was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, pinned up in neat rows. And they were all of me, pictures of me in my apartment, pictures of me on assignments in other states, pictures of me sleeping, eating, working. Some of them were recent. Some of them looked decades old, yellowed and faded, showing me at ages I hadn't reached yet, in places I'd never been. The whistling was inside the room now, coming from the radio equipment even though nothing was powered on. And underneath the whistling, I heard voices. They were speaking my name over and over, a chant that grew louder and more insistent. The door behind me started to open. Slowly, the metal hinges creaking like a scream. I pressed my back against the far wall, watching in horror as the shadow figures poured through the opening like smoke, filling the room with their presence. They surrounded me, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating off them, cold that burned like fire. And then they reached out and touched me. Fingers made of ice and darkness pressed against my skin, and I felt something being pulled from inside me. Not my life, not my soul, but something else. My presence, my reality. They were trying to erase me from existence, to make it so I'd never been born, never existed anywhere except in this room with these photographs. I screamed. I don't remember much after that. Just running through darkness, through passages that twisted and changed, through doors that opened onto impossible spaces. At some point, I saw light ahead. Real light, gray and cold, but real. I ran toward it and burst out of a tunnel entrance I didn't recognize, collapsing in the snow outside. Derek found me an hour later. He said I'd been gone for 6 hours. That search and rescue had been organizing to come find me. But my watch showed only 20 minutes had passed. I tried to tell him what happened, about the shadow figures and the photographs and the whistling that spoke my name. He just nodded, like he heard it all before. Later, in my hotel room, I reviewed the photos I'd taken in the tunnels. Most were normal shots of concrete and darkness, but in 3 of them, caught in the background of ordinary tunnel photographs, were the shadow figures, standing in groups, watching the camera, watching me. And in one photo, the clearest one, I could see their faces. They were the faces of other explorers, people who had gone into the tunnels and never really come back out. Their features twisted and wrong, their eyes black pits, their mouths open in silent screams. They'd been absorbed by whatever lived in those passages, turned into shadows that hunted for new victims. I left Whittier the next morning, and I've never gone back. But the whistling followed me home. I hear it sometimes late at night, coming from vents and pipes, from the spaces between walls. And occasionally, very occasionally, I hear my name whispered in the darkness. Not asking me to come back, promising me that something from those tunnels is coming to find me. The magazine never ran my story. They said the photos were too disturbing, that they gave people nightmares. They were right, because now I know the truth about those tunnels beneath Whittier. They were not abandoned. They were a trap, a hunting ground for something that has been down there since those passages were built, maybe longer. Something that collects people, turns them into shadows, adds them to its eternal whistling chorus beneath the frozen earth. So here is my question for you. If you heard your name called from the darkness of an abandoned place, would you have the strength to ignore it? Or would curiosity drag you into passages that lead nowhere but down, into the arms of something that has been waiting for you all along? Write your answer in the comments, because I already made my choice, and I'm still paying for it. Story 9. Last transmission. The terror of Flight 1628. I was there, not on the plane, but in the tower. I heard Captain Terachi's voice break into static as something massive descended around his cargo jet over the frozen darkness of Alaska. And his final words before all contact was lost or burned into my memory forever. It was trying to pull us into the ice. Then nothing, only silence, and a mystery that nobody in the aviation community has ever adequately explained. The question I am asking you to answer in the comments is this: what would you do if you witnessed something impossible happening in real time? Something that defied every law of physics and reason, and then you were pressured to stay silent about it for the rest of your life. My name is Robert Hayes, and I'm 68 years old. I spent 35 years as an air traffic controller for the FAA, working at various stations throughout the western United States and Alaska. I was good at my job. I was meticulous and careful and utterly devoted to the safety of every aircraft and every person aboard. I had a spotless record. I had never made a mistake that jeopardized a flight. That is, until the night of November 18th, 1986, when I witnessed something so terrifying and so utterly unexplainable that it destroyed my entire understanding of reality. Flight 1628 was a Japanese cargo aircraft, a Boeing 747F, carrying a load of electrical equipment from Paris to Anchorage. The flight was routine. The crew was professional and experienced. Captain Terachi was an accomplished pilot with thousands of hours of flight experience. Everything about the flight seemed absolutely normal until it reached a point approximately 200 miles southeast of Anchorage, over a vast and empty stretch of frozen Alaskan terrain. That is when the first report came in. Captain Tarachi radioed that he had something on his weather radar. Something large. Something that shouldn't be there. He reported that the object appeared to be moving, and that it seemed to be on a collision course with his aircraft. I remember his voice was calm but careful, the voice of a pilot who was trained to report anomalies without jumping to conclusions. I looked at our radar screens, and I saw nothing. Nothing on the flight path. Nothing in the surrounding airspace. I told Captain Tarachi that our radar was not picking up any traffic. I told him that he was clear to continue on his current heading. I told him that he was probably experiencing some kind of weather phenomenon or maybe a radar artifact. But Captain Tarachi was insistent. He said that whatever was on his weather radar was large. Very large. Larger than any aircraft he had ever seen. He said that it was moving in a way that no conventional aircraft could move. He said that the radar return was so strong that it was almost burning out his instruments. My supervisor, a man named Frank Martinez, came over to my station. He had been listening to the radio exchange, and his face had gone pale. He knew something I didn't. He leaned over and whispered to me that we should log this interaction very carefully, that we should document everything that Captain Tarachi reported, but that we should be prepared that this information might not be shared publicly. I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. Over the next few minutes, Captain Tarachi's reports became increasingly alarmed. He said that the object was now visible on his aircraft, this visual range. He said it was enormous. He said it appeared to be surrounded by some kind of luminescence or glow. He said the object was flying at a speed and at an altitude that should have been physically impossible for any known aircraft. And then he said something that made the blood drain from my face. He said the object was descending directly toward his aircraft. I watched the radar blip representing Flight 1628 as it moved across our screen. I watched as Captain Tarachi reported the object getting closer and closer. I listened as his voice grew more and more agitated. Other aircraft in the airspace began to chime in, reporting that they could also see something on radar now. Something massive that was moving in ways that violated the basic principles of aerodynamics. And then, in a moment that would replay in my nightmares for the rest of my life, Captain Tarachi screamed. It wasn't the carefully controlled pilot's report anymore. It was a raw, terrified scream of someone who was witnessing something that his brain couldn't process, something that his training couldn't prepare him for, something that was so absolutely horrible that the veneer of professional composure simply shattered. He screamed that the object had enormous bright white lights. He screamed that it was moving alongside his aircraft now, matching his speed perfectly, moving with him as though it was attached to him. He screamed that his instruments were going wild, that his compass was spinning, that his altitude indicator was showing impossible readings. And then he screamed the words that I will never forget for as long as I live. It's trying to pull us into the ice. It's pulling us down. It's trying to pull us into the ice. I heard the sound of alarms blaring in the background on his transmission. I heard the terrified voice of the flight engineer. I heard sounds that I couldn't identify, sounds like metal groaning under impossible stress, sounds like the aircraft itself was being torn apart from the outside. And then there was a sound like a massive static burst, and then nothing. Complete silence. Flight 1628 was gone from our radar, gone from all known tracking systems. There was no confirmation of a crash. There was no distress call. There was just silence, the eerie and terrifying silence of an aircraft that had simply ceased to exist. The tower erupted into controlled chaos. Other flights were given alternate routing. Search and rescue was dispatched. The military was contacted. Every agency that could possibly help was mobilized to find Flight 1628 and figure out what had happened. The search continued for weeks. The aircraft was never found. No wreckage was ever recovered. No bodies were ever discovered. It was as though Flight 1628, with its cargo and its crew of 3, had simply vanished into the frozen Alaskan night and ceased to exist. The official explanation, released months later, was that Captain Tarachi had experienced some kind of equipment malfunction combined with a weather phenomenon that had confused his instruments. The FAA suggested that he had misinterpreted unusual atmospheric conditions as an aircraft or unidentified flying object. The official position was that the fear and confusion brought on by the apparent equipment failure had caused Captain Tarachi to panic, and that this panic had resulted in some kind of catastrophic flight control error that had caused the aircraft to crash. It was a complete and utter lie, and everyone in that control tower knew it. Frank Martinez called me into his office the next day. He closed the door and he told me something that explained everything. The FAA had received reports of this phenomenon before. There had been other incidents, other aircraft that had experienced similar encounters with large unidentified objects over remote areas of Alaska and Canada. In some cases, the aircraft had managed to escape. In other cases, they had not. In every single case, the official position had been that the pilots were confused or mistaken or in some cases mentally unstable. The incidents had been covered up. The records had been sealed. The public had been kept completely in the dark. Frank told me that my responsibility was to keep quiet about what I had witnessed. He said that national security was at stake. He said that if word got out that there were massive unidentified objects in the skies over North America, if word got out that they could apparently affect aircraft in ways that our best scientists couldn't, he explained, then there would be mass panic. There would be questions that nobody could answer. The government could not allow that. I asked him what these objects were. I asked him if the military knew what they were. I asked him if this was some kind of classified military project. Frank looked at me with eyes that held a terrible burden of knowledge, and he told me that he didn't. Tino. He said that the government didn't. Tino. He said that as far as anyone could determine, these objects were not made by any human government. They were not American. They were not Soviet. They were not anything that fit into any known category of aircraft or technology. And they were interested in human aircraft. For some reason that nobody could explain, these massive unidentified objects seemed to actively seek out aircraft. They seemed to pursue them. And in at least 3 documented cases over the previous decade, they seemed to have succeeded in capturing or colliding with the aircraft, resulting in the complete and total loss of the plane and everyone on board. I spent the next 35 years keeping that secret. I attended mandatory debriefings where I was instructed on what I could and could not discuss. I signed documents that threatened serious legal consequences if I revealed what I had witnessed. I lived with the knowledge that an entire aircraft with innocent crew members had simply vanished, and that the public explanation was a complete fabrication. But I couldn't stop thinking about Flight 1628. I couldn't stop replaying Captain Terrace, his final words in my mind. I couldn't stop wondering what exactly he had encountered in that frozen darkness over Alaska. I couldn't stop imagining the terror those crew members must have felt as they watched something impossible descend upon their aircraft, as they felt their plane being pulled down toward the ice by some force or intelligence that they couldn't fight or escape from. I retired from the FAA in 1999, but I couldn't let it go. I began to research what had happened to Flight 1628. I learned that the Japanese Aviation Authority had kept more detailed records than the FAA had released. I learned that Captain Terrace had actually reported seeing the object before our tower had any radar contact with it. I learned that there had been photographs taken by military bases in Alaska that showed something massive in the sky on the night of the incident, photographs that had been classified and were still classified. I learned that I was not alone in my knowledge. There were other people who had been there that night. Other controllers, other military personnel, other witnesses who had all been sworn to silence and who all lived with the same terrible burden of knowledge. I began to reach out to some of them, carefully, cautiously. Many of them refused to speak with me. Some of them hung up the phone the moment they realized who I was. But a few of them, people who were close enough to retirement that they no longer feared the consequences, agreed to meet with me and share what they knew. And what they told me painted a picture of a phenomenon that was far more widespread and far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. The objects had been appearing over Alaska for decades. They had been reported by pilots and military personnel and civilians. In the 1940s, there had been reports of them. In the 1950s, there had been more reports. By the time I started working at the tower, there had been hundreds of sightings, all documented, all classified, all kept away from public knowledge. And the most terrifying thing I learned was this: the objects seemed to be studying us. The pilots who had managed to escape encounters with these massive craft reported that the objects had moved in ways that suggested intelligence and purpose. They moved alongside aircraft as though they were examining them. They matched the aircraft's maneuvers exactly, as though they were learning how our aircraft moved and flew. And in the cases where they seemed to make contact with the aircraft, where they seemed to succeed in pulling them down toward the frozen terrain below, the pattern suggested something even more horrifying. It was as though they were capturing the aircraft. It was as though they were taking them somewhere. It was as though they were collecting samples. I have spent the last 20 years thinking about Captain Terrace and his crew. I have spent those years wondering what happened to them after contact was lost. Did their aircraft crash into the ice? Did they die instantly in the impact? Or did they survive long enough to realize that they had been taken somewhere, that something far more horrible was happening to them than a simple crash? The eerie and unsettling truth is that I will probably never know. The official records remain classified. The incidents continue to be denied by government agencies. The public remains completely unaware that there have been multiple aircraft lost under mysterious circumstances, and that at least some of those losses may be connected to contact with massive unidentified objects that display no known characteristics of any human technology. I'm telling you this story now because I'm old. I'm running out of time, and I can bear the thought of taking this knowledge to my grave without at least attempting to share it with anyone who might listen and wonder and question the official narratives that we have been given. Flight 1628 disappeared over Alaska in 1986. 3 people died that night. 3 people whose names have been essentially erased from history. Captain Tarachi and his 2 crew members. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have the truth about what happened to them revealed. They deserve better than being buried under layers of government secrecy and official denial. And I think the most terrifying aspect of this entire experience is understanding that nobody is going to do anything about it. The government will continue to deny. The official records will remain sealed. The public will continue to be kept in ignorance. And something out there in the darkness over Alaska will continue to exist, continue to watch, continue to hunt. And nobody will ever know until it happens again, until another aircraft encounters these massive unidentified objects, until another crew loses contact forever. That is the horror that haunts me every single day. Not just the mystery of what happened to Flight 1628, but the knowledge that this is real. It's happening. It is documented. And the entire world is choosing to pretend it doesn't exist. So my final question for you is this. If you knew for certain that something terrifying and unexplainable was happening in our skies, something that was beyond our understanding and our control, would you want to know about it? Or would you prefer to live in comfortable ignorance, believing that the world is safe and rational and everything is under control? Tell me in the comments what you would choose.